Welcome to this week's episode of the Good Luck Club podcast. My guest today is John Elkington, Executive Chairman and Co-founder of Volans Ventures. John, welcome.
Simon, it's wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I'd like to start off, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps introducing yourself to my audience.
Oh, God, that's a problem. I've always resisted the elevator pitch where you've got those few seconds to tell people who you are and what you want from them. And part of the problem is I've been in the environmental then sustainability space for over 50 years. During that time, I've set up 4 social businesses since 1978. They all still exist. The third one was called Sustainability. I've written 20 books. I'm just starting a new one. And I suppose the final thing to say is that over those years, I've served on 70 boards or advisory boards. So from very big companies like Nestle to small social enterprises and NGOs and so on. So I don't know what the hell I am, but somebody could at some stage usefully stick a label on all of that. I'd be grateful.
Yeah, well, I of course I did my research and did read about you before you came on the show, and I think I just couldn't stop reading. There was so much you've done, so much things you've been involved in, and that's why I partly wanted to interview you to see where you're at today and your mindset today after all this experience on things like innovation and sustainability and all of these elements that you've been involved in your whole life. So what a legacy, by the way. I just want to say up front how much respect I have for all the things that you've done. I'd like to start off by asking if you wouldn't mind defining what success means to you. I think it's good for my audience to get a gauge of what you think that is so that they can get a gauge of who you are.
It's interesting because I've never really thought about legacy. And quite a number of the CEOs, business leaders and so on that we work with, they're quite upfront that what they're thinking about is legacy. To me, success has been always sort of somewhere out in the distance. And in some ways, I've always felt, people talk about an imposter syndrome. I'm often in situations where I'm dealing with very senior, very powerful people. And I'm always asking myself the question, is what I'm doing the best that can be offered, or wouldn't these people actually be better off with somebody else doing it? So success is at the individual level. So for me, partly that's, I have a sense of mission. I've had it since I was very young. Am I serving that mission? But am I learning and am I actually having fun along the way? And then it scales, and by the time you get to a team and an organization, is that organization alive? I mean, is it still on its feet? Is it doing good work? In our field, is it having a really serious positive impact? Is it the best that we can be doing at this particular moment in time? And then overarching everything is the planetary scale. And there, in terms of success, I look at what's happened to, for example, the climate or to biodiversity and genetic, wild gene loss over my life. And it's not success. It's exactly the reverse. Most of these big system crises or emergencies are actually getting significantly worse. So at some level, I feel a complete and utter failure. At other levels, I can sort of tell you a story around, the personal level or the organizations, which sounds like success. But it's difficult to marry some of this stuff up sometimes.
It's interesting you mentioned that concept of legacy as well, because I guess we think. I was just having a conversation with someone prior to this podcast about how young people still seem to crave money, and you can't take money with you. The only thing you really leave behind is legacy. And so, but it is interesting. You've never thought about it as a legacy. You've never looked at your body of work and seen it as a legacy. You've just seen it as missions that you're on, I guess.
Well, in a way, I mean, it's possible, and you're constantly reminded. I'm 71, and a lot of people who are baby boomers, as I've been, and have got the same age, are now talking about retirement, and quite a number are already retired. I'm not. I actually think that the next 10 to 15 years are going to be by far the most, I often say it, but exciting, challenging, and dangerous of my entire working life. And all of that, because the system that we've all grown up with is starting to break apart. And that's macroeconomic, it's geopolitical, it's many different things. And that sounds desperate, and indeed it will be. But at the same time, you need the old order to die in order for the new one to come through sufficiently strongly. So I want to play into that next phase of all of this. No, legacy I'll probably think about if I get into my 90s or whatever. Both my parents died last year. They were both in their late 90s. I've always said I wanted to be dead by the time I was 70, but now that I'm 71, I've slightly retuned that metric.
I guess that's also, you always think 10 years older than you is old. So that's the...
Funny. That can be true. But the odd thing is, when I was a child, my friends were often 40 to 50 years older than me. And I've always been blind to age in a weird way. And now that I'm in my 70s, I find that many of my friends are actually, a third or a quarter of my age. So yeah, it's, but in a sense, it's not one thing or another. You actually, the critical challenge now is we've all got to work right the way across the generations. We can't just be a baby boomer. We can't just be Gen X or a millennial or whatever it is. We've got to sort of be blind to age, but not be blind to the challenges that the different generations are actually facing.
I know exactly what you mean about the age thing. I mean, I started a business at 15 years old and everyone thought I was too young. But I think, it doesn't really matter what age you are. It matters.
What was that business doing? What was the theme?
A gardening company. Very sophisticated,
Fantastic.
Very high tech. Basically, someone had a messy garden and I offered to take care of it. It was, there was no apps around in those days. These days, you have an app for that. You just press a button and someone does it for you. But in my era, 30 years ago, you knocked on someone's door and said, "Your garden's messy. Would you like me to take care of it?" So
I've got a solar robot that will do your lawn for the next.
That's the future. But it's. But I like this whole element of taking age out of the equation. I actually think taking time out of the equation is quite an interesting one too. Like you just said there, and I love it. The next 10, 15 years are going to be the most prolific of my life, the hardest, the most exciting. I think that ironically probably keeps you young too, because it sounds like you're going to need a lot of energy for what you have planned.
Well, that goes back to what I said earlier on. For me, success is in large part, am I actually having fun? Am I learning? Am I meeting interesting new people? One of the wretched sides of COVID-19, people have had desperate family and personal losses and so on. But for me, it's not traveling. And since my new book came out in early April, I've done over 60 virtual keynotes and podcasts and things like that in over 30 countries. But I'm just so frustrated because, putting flight shame slightly to one side for the moment, I love traveling to interesting places and meeting new people and just getting into ongoing conversations. And many of those turn into friendships that last, hopefully, a lifetime.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, as a podcast host, I am missing the energy of sitting with someone and doing it. But hopefully as well, there's some irony in it. It makes us appreciate those things when they come back. So there's something in not having it for a while makes us appreciate it again, right?
Yes, I live in hope.
Yeah. I love the word fun coming into the conversation, particularly in business world. I don't think it's brought into the conversation enough. So how do you ensure fun? What is fun?
Well, you try very hard not to work too hard on it, because then that just squashes the thing flat. When we set up sustainability, for example, in 1987, and we were casting around for values, the three that I came up with and stuck for quite some time were we wanted to make a difference. That's become more commonplace, but at the time that was a little unusual. We wanted to make a profit because we were a business. We were a social business, but as we might now be called. But we wanted to make a profit because then that became our buffer against adversity. We could invest in future activities and so on. And also we couldn't be pushed around because we weren't totally dependent on other people's money. But the third one was to have fun and learn as we did what we did. So the answer is, some people just are genetically predisposed not to have fun, and you just sort of probably don't want to have them on the team. So when our current CEO was being interviewed about 2.5 years ago, my first question to her was, she has her family have a Labradoodle. She didn't know that her husband had put the Labradoodle on her CV. So my first question to her was, what is the point of a Labradoodle? And just to see how somebody responded. She actually she responded brilliantly well, which is one of the reasons why we took her on. But I think if you do it all around away days, and like Google having sort of playpens for employees or associates or whatever they're called, that's one thing. I just think the work itself should be fun. And to me, many years ago, younger colleagues would ask me, how can you go into a potential client company and know in relatively short order, sometimes within minutes, that you can work with them and it probably in one way or another will work out right? And I said, but the answer for me, one of the critical metrics, is that there's humor, there's playfulness, there is that sort of ability to see different sides of a challenge or an opportunity. And it's odd. It's worked out quite well over time. But so I'm not in the game of force feeding people fun. But I just you have to create cultures or co-evolve cultures that just make coming to work not a strain.
I can hear my audience asking, what is the point of a Labradoodle?
Well, actually, it's funny, but Louise Chiala-Roper, who's our CEO, her response was partly, have you got Secret Service sort of stalking me? But then she said, when they came to choosing the Labradoodle, it was to do with allergies, it was to do with temperament. It was that Labradoodle, Flossie, is now on our website as one of our team. So I think something like Chief Happiness Officer, not quite. That was the Just Foods formula. But I think dogs of the right sort are just, they make people feel comfortable and anchored and so on. So I don't have a dog myself, but there we go.
Oh, okay. I have 2 dogs, and I can honestly say that they're kind of like my best friends. They always listen. Yeah. And they will always be happy to see you, unlike my wife.
Well, it's funny. I often said I'm more of a cat person than a dog. But if it was a dog, the sort of dog that I would incline towards would be a lurcher. And they're very sort of left field animals and pretty rangy. But there's something about their wild intelligence which I quite like.
I've had both. So to me, it's a bit like saying I'm a parent, but I'm the one that likes the happy type of child. Cats are fun because they're moody, and dogs are fun because they're not. That diversity in the two makes it. I
think it's partly cats are their own creatures, and that's quite what I like about them. But
there is a chance we're going off topic. There is a chance. I don't know. I might be wrong.
We may be absolutely sort of plumb center in the topic, but
there's some metaphor there that's quite interesting. But tell us about the book you've just written. Not I'm getting you to plug it, but I'm interested in where your mind's been recently.
Well, it's my 20th, and some books have worked out spectacularly well, and some have just bombed. And partly it's a question of timing. It's partly does the stories almost speak for itself. And in this particular case, I originally started to write a book around artificial intelligence, and because I've been visiting people in that field, and I was quite interested to see how they thought, and I was quite worried about some of the things I was in the process of discovering. But the publishers that the proposal was pitched to said, actually, there's too much on AI. And so I'd been casting around for a different way of framing it. And I'd long really admired the work of Nassim Nicholas Taleb. So his book, The Black Swan, came out just before the 2007-2009 financial discontinuity or crash or contained depression or whatever we call it. And his view was that there are these events that come along, and that crash was, in his mind, a black swan, which are a complete surprise. We didn't expect it. We should have expected a crash, but we didn't. Secondly, they have an impact that's off the scale greater than people are actually used to. And then thirdly, afterwards, we sit down and try and understand what's just happened to us, and we sort of get the wrong end of the stick. And so it's interesting that a lot of people have been saying that COVID-19 is a black swan. And Taleb himself is saying, no, it isn't. People did see it coming. It wasn't, or it shouldn't have been, a surprise. So that was the kickoff point. And I thought, well, actually, a lot of these black swans are things that take us exponentially where we don't want to go. And so the book is full of examples like plastics in the ocean and antibiotic resistance and obesity, chronic disease, type 2 diabetes, and so on, space debris, the climate emergency, all of these sort of wicked problems that are getting, it seems, almost inexorably worse. So I said, what would it be like if you had solutions that went the opposite direction? They took us exponentially where we did want to go. What about green swans? So the title of the book is Green Swans. The subtitle is The Coming Boom, because people like booms when they're in business, in Regenerative Capitalism. And, you know, we can talk about that perhaps, but I just think I've mentioned the term sustainability, and I've been one of the champions of that. But I think we got to one of those points where we really got to rethink what we mean by terms like that. But that's the book.
Great. Well, we'll put the link in the broadcast below.
Thank you.
Anyone that's interested can grab that. I know I am. I think that there's an interesting point you're making there about black swan events, actually. And I know a lot of people out there right now listening are perhaps losing their job, or they're rethinking whether or not they like the job they have. And I guess black swan event, is it a negative thing or a positive thing? And I think a lot of the things you're talking about there, it's about how people react to the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
So is it the black swan event, you could say, is COVID, but depending on how you react to it, whether or not there's a positive or negative. I think obesity is a good example of that. You read about what obesity does to you. You know, if you read that and then you adjust your lifestyle and eat better and so on, then you know that can be a positive impact on you, or you continue to eat badly and it has a negative impact on you, right?
No, it's absolutely true. And I think in a way, diabetes is almost a pandemic, and it's been created in large part by our diets and by our increasingly sedentary, sitting around lifestyles. And for many years, I worked with the world's biggest insulin provider, Novo Nordisk, in Denmark. And what was striking about that company was they could have looked at diabetes basically as a gold mine, because the pandemic is spreading very rapidly around the world. One of the worst countries is Mexico, where I've worked. China, with a single child family, has spoiled a generation or several generations of children. So their body weight is much higher than it really ought to be. So they've set themselves up for this time bomb of diabetes. So Novo Nordisk could have sat back and said, fabulous, now we're going to go in it. But they didn't. They thought, what are the implications of this? And one of the implications would be that in weaker countries, poorer countries, the costs of maintaining people with diabetes could collapse public healthcare systems. So Novo Nordisk started to understudy or learn from NGOs, activist organizations like Oxfam, to say, how do you actually campaign to get people to be more sensible with their diet, more sensible with their exercise regimes? And how could they or we work with, for example, cities, city administration, city mayors, to get people to think about this more intelligently? So part of what I've done over the years is try and find companies like that, and there aren't many, and help them do more of that sort of thing, to sort of head off some of these wicked problems at the pass.
It's all interlinking, all the things that you're doing, I think. And one thing I'd just like to jump back to something you said earlier, which is don't work too hard on it. Now, what happens in the entrepreneur world is anyone that's listening to, how to become an entrepreneur, what they'll hear from a lot of gurus is work hard, grind, 19 hours a day, 7 days a week. You work, you'll get luckier. The harder you work, the luckier you get, things like that thrown around. But what you're talking about when you say don't work too hard, I want a lot of people to pick up on that. I don't want that to get lost, actually, because I think that is gold. Because I think so often people think that working hard is going to equal success, but it won't necessarily equal sustainability or fun, which is very important. And what you're talking about when then taking that point you made earlier and elongating it to what you're talking about right now, definitely companies, I think, have to have that mindset too. It's not about coining it now.
Yeah.
It's about thinking about the long-term impact of coining it now. If the healthcare system collapses, then that's not good for sustainability long-term.
No, it's not good for anyone. But, my wife is somewhere else in the house. We've been together for 52 years. She would be cackling if she could hear this conversation, because she would say, I've worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the last 50 years. So I'm not saying don't work hard, but I'm saying in the middle of that, recognize that you've got to give yourself space in order to enjoy life while it's there, rather than simply just strapping yourself to the treadmill and just assuming at some stage you'll earn enough money to sort of basically buy yourself out of the system that you've just created. So I am saying that if you're going to do something that is really going to move the needle, you probably are, unless you're incredibly fortunate and you have this sort of sudden brainwave and can just see ways to do things, you're going to have to work quite hard, and you're going to have people around you who also work hard and do so effectively and to some degree efficiently over time. But the fun element actually screws up to some degree the efficiency. Partly what I've always said that I was once in Australia about 30 years ago, and I was asked in public, I think in Sydney, a major conference, somebody said, what is your most important strategic tool? And I just went, in the instant, I went back and said, our sofas, our couches, because that's where the conversations happen. That's where people relax. That's where some of the stuff that you wouldn't otherwise thought of comes to mind, or where people come in from the outside. And, you just get comfortable with each other and with new people. And I think certainly in my world, that flow of people, that flow of thinking, that flow of ideas has been incredibly important.
I think what you're talking about there, another way of framing it, is work-life balance, because I feel like working hard only feels that way if you're perhaps not working on something you really love. That sounds to me. To stop your wife laughing for a minute about this, I think basically, there's an element of you're willing to work 24 hours a day, mindset, thinking about it, and so on, and 7 days a week, because actually it's your life, it's lifestyle. Yeah. It's not, I'm not working today, therefore I shouldn't be thinking about it anymore, because these problems don't go away because you stop thinking about them, first of all, and you're working on some pretty big things, and you're thinking about some pretty important things. So, but isn't that, a lot of people ask me that question about work-life balance, and my answer personally is always there's no such thing. What do you think?
I think there can be, and I think if you're doing work that you don't really enjoy every moment of the day, then work-life balance is incredibly important, because even in activist organizations, groups like Friends of the Earth, I've seen campaigners and activists burn themselves out because they're so committed. They don't give themselves time to do the right thing for their health or whatever, including their mental health. So I think work-life balance remains very important, but like anything that gets professionalized and institutionalized and so on, it to some degree gets quite boring too. So I also recognize that it's an immense privilege to find yourself in a field where you actually do get constant positive feedback from what you're doing, that you really do enjoy it. I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't disasters along the way, and sometimes catastrophes. Of course there are, but I don't know. I can think of very few other things that I could have done with the amount of pleasure, if I can put it that way, as what I've done. Even though, as I said, back to your question around success, in many ways, at the big picture level, it hasn't been a success. I think, our species has continued to trash the planet. And I think things have got better in critical areas, and I'm sure will continue to do so. But the point of the book is that if we simply try to do things incrementally, this isn't going to work. And that's where most people currently are. Let's do a little bit more, be a little bit more transparent, a little bit more accountable, and it'll work out right. Well, no, it won't. We've really got to go exponential. And that's part of my last sort of 7 or 8 years has been trying to think about how do we do that? And how do we do that through business? And, it's still an inquiry underway.
I think you're talking there, in my view, again, about like human mindset change as well. I mean, I
Yeah.
think for so many people, I mean, I had this conversation recently with someone where I'm like, are you doing what you love every day? Is it purposeful to you? They're like, no, but eventually I'll pay my mortgage off and then I'll be happy.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, you are going to die, right? So, you've only got a certain amount of time left. Is it really worth it just to own a property at the end of it?
Yeah.
But people, they don't think they're going to die. They don't think they're going to die. And that's the only certainty we've got. They try to then translate that into making people realize how, bad diabetes is for them, even if it's not affecting them. People can't make that correlation. So what's been your experience? When you say positive feedback, I think a lot of people are quite negative about this as well, right?
Well, it's funny, that sort of death thing. I've except for when I was a child, I've never been. It's the matter of how you die rather than whether you die. And as I said earlier on, I've always wanted to be gone by the time I was 70, simply because I didn't want to hang around when I was not terribly useful. Having had parents who lived such long lives, I think maybe I'm going to be around for a little bit longer. But I don't fear death, again, I'm not sort of trying to stack up a legacy, but I do feel an obligation in a way to the younger people now and the generations to come to try and ensure that as best we can, they are born into, to some degree, inherit a world that is better than we found it. Now, that's going to be really hard because, since I was a child, so many of the things I care for haven't got better. I mean, technology's got better, and lifespans have got better, and healthcare's got better. If it weren't for modern pharmaceuticals and so on, I would have died at least twice. So I acknowledge the joys and the pleasures of modern life, but that sense of almost culpability, of blame for what's happened, and that sense of responsibility for really pushing other people to think different. And it is about mindsets. It's trying to shift people from the point of view where they think, that's somebody else's problem, that's government's problem, or whatever it is, and I'll protect my children or grandchildren or whatever, to actually we're all in this together, and not just the human species, every species is somehow in this. Just a tiny final just flip point on the work-life balance front. I was on a call earlier on today with a very interesting young man who works for a surfboard company on the continent, and he told me the story of how he was sailboarding with a friend, and the friend was almost killed, almost drowned, and both of them in that moment thought, "What are we doing with our lives?" and concluded that neither of them were doing work that they really wanted to do. So this guy said, actually, I've always wanted to work with a surf company. So 6 years later, he moved to a different city, now works with a brilliant company in the surfing space. So it's probably easier to do that when we're younger than when we're sort of locked into an organization, locked into a career path. But I think one of the great things about the modern world is that increasingly those sort of jobs for life trajectories are increasingly not happening, even in places like Japan, where they were absolutely standard for so long. So there are more opportunities to sort of stand back and think, what do I really want to do with the rest of my life? And really what I want to do with the rest of my life is not just more of what I've been doing, because that's been effective up to a point, but not sufficiently to hit that big metric of success, but to sort of reinvent what we do. And that I like, because it's like being a surfer. It's like being on that leading edge of a new wave and having to make it up as you go along. I love being in that space where everything is happening in the instant and you're having to make things up as you go along.
Yeah, I one of the reasons I wanted to interview you, because I resonate with a lot of the way you think, and I want people to grasp some of the knowledge that you have. Like this reinvent yourself point, I think a lot of people today can reinvent themselves. I mean, I'm taking age out of the equation. I don't think it matters what age you are. You can reinvent yourself. The only downside can be if you perhaps, for example, got a lot of payments going out every month, and you've got to perhaps stay in the job you're in to make those payments. So I'm also an advocate of reducing debt if you can. But I would say how you live, not how you die, matters. So that kind of that near-death experience can actually make people realise perhaps what they've been doing isn't enough, or isn't isn't a legacy. So it's definitely an interesting thing.
This is for the cutting room floor, but in terms of near-death experiences, I did have one. I took LSD back in the 60s, and it lasted 4 years.
Wow.
I'm very pleased.
There's going to be some people in the comments now wanting to know where you bought that from.
Well, I think it's partly the wiring of your brain, not simply what you put into it. But partway through that, I had an experience which was, where you separate out from your body, you're up against the ceiling, you've got a long silver cord. I went to see my grandmother, my favorite grandmother, and I had many grandmothers, about a week later. And she said, "Hello, darling, what have you been doing?" And I said, "Well, I took LSD last week." And she said, "Tell me about it." So I told her about what had happened. And she said she almost died in South Africa when she was 12. And exactly the same thing had happened to her. She'd been up against the ceiling, looking back at her body, long sort of silver thread back into her body. Well, how odd was that, just to have had the same experience and then have a grandmother who was open to having that conversation? Another reason why I think conversation is at the root of all of this. We've really got to work out how to talk to each other and be quite honest about what we've done and what has worked and what hasn't, because very often we can learn so much from what didn't work.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I love talking about failure. I love it when people talk about failure. You learn so much more than from success. Part of my premise of this podcast is that success can often just be attributed to luck. Failure, however, you quite often know where you went wrong and can learn from it. And your point about conversation is also so true. I mean, my grandparents have passed away now, but so many times I tried to talk to them about my mother and her history, because my grandfather, long story short, actually had to take my mother away from her real mother when she was about 1 year old. But they never want to talk about it. I always want to understand what went wrong, especially as a father myself now. What happened? What can I learn from them? They never wanted to talk about it. It was like, we don't want to talk about it. And that's still a regret I have today that they wouldn't talk about it. And you're very lucky to have a grandmother that will let you have an open conversation about taking LSD, and then you probably both learned something.
It's funny because my father was a Battle of Britain pilot. He wouldn't talk about that for a very long time afterwards. And I just say that simply to say to people, just persist and don't sort of try and sort of chisel the knowledge out of people, but just set up the conditions where they feel better able to share what it is that happened to them and what they learned from that. And I look back at his career, and in fact, I just 2 days ago discovered something he'd written for myself and my siblings, which was, and he did a series of things, but one was about luck and about how he was shot down in the Battle of Britain, which saved his life, paradoxically, because his squadron was decimated in the coming weeks while he was in hospital. He was blown back over land by his flight leader, something that never happened before, never happened since. And then you just go through his life and you see time and again, he was on the convoys around to Russia. His convoy was the only one that wasn't attacked either way, so he survived. He was in a squadron that was sent to beat up tanks on the D-Day beaches, and instead he was sent to India. So 38 of the 40 people in his squadron were killed during D-Day, and he was sent off to India. The two of them were sent off, and the other man was shot down and beheaded by the Japanese. And just time and time and time again, he had these lucky moments. Now, I don't count on that, because one of my absolute core values is serendipity, which is not relying on luck. It's creating the conditions, and a lot of it's intuitive, where luck can flow towards you, where the future can come to you in a way that you can engage with and hopefully do the right sort of thing. It's something I've never had a manual. I've never had a blueprint that I could work from. It's a lot of it is instinctive, but luck is nice, but I think serendipity is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I like the philosophy. I mean, the point about luck, my view, is that actually there should be two definitions of luck in the dictionary. And I'm on a mission to update the dictionary, because I think right now there's only one, this kind of random concept of luck, which you could argue where you're born. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your childhood in a minute, but where you're born. And then, of course, there's the other type of luck, which is what you're talking about, I think, where you can influence it. And there's a lot out there, including stuff I've personally written about how you can influence luck. But ultimately, that there is two, really, isn't there? Because I mean, you could argue COVID is no one's fault. It's bad luck, good luck, depending on your perspective as well. Because I think perspective is a very important element of luck, right?
Well, I also think it's a systemic issue that if you build a global economy that is linked by subways and airways and so on, and you get involved in wildlife trafficking and digging guano out of bat caves and so on, and then you don't properly monitor viruses when they inevitably escape, and you're involved in cutting down forests and so on, the chances of pandemics hitting the global population are radically enhanced. So I think one of the lessons I hope we're learning from all of this is not only there will be more pandemics and there will be worse ones, but the more and more of the crises that and the opportunities that we face are systemic. Everything links now to everything else, and our brains don't necessarily do that. So I think part of what if I have brought value over the years, it's by my job title is Chief Pollinator. It's linking things that wouldn't otherwise necessarily be linked in the hope and belief that there will be some form of hybrid vigor that comes out of all of that.
I love the word pollinate as well. I think it's kind of reminds you how important the ecosystem is. That we're all actually interconnected. Again, I think sometimes worlds become it's about me, it's about what I've got, I'm all right, I've got food. I'm that kind of mindset. But I do like Chief Pollinator Officer.
Well, in a way, that's where the sofas and so on come in, because and the traveling, because it's one of the great privileges of this field, such as it is, that you're constantly meeting people who are both interesting and interested, but actually quite different. I mean, there's hugely diverse people coming into this space now, scientists, technologists, economists, physicists, I mean, you name it. And just ordinary people. You said just before we started that, you were skeptical about university education. And I do think education now is breaking out of the classroom. It's breaking out of the lecture halls. And COVID-19 has given that a really big shunt. So if people are willing to learn in new ways, by God, the opportunities are there now. I mean, it's not just the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's not even Wikipedia. Just the level of knowledge that is out there and accessible is extraordinary.
I couldn't agree more. I actually think that's partly why there's such a big burst in podcasts too, because there's so much knowledge out there that people want to plug into, and podcasts are perhaps the company for you on the sofa right now if you've got to keep distant from people. But I'm just thinking right now about setting up a company with a CPO and a CFO. The CFO is the Chief Fun Officer, and the Chief Pollinator Officer. It sounds like the beginnings of a whole new company structure. Is this book 21?
I see the thing veering all over the road, but it could indeed be fun.
Would you get any investors? I don't know. Chief Mad Officer.
I think the answer is you've had companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, coming up with sort of chief happiness officers, and I think increasingly people do realize that culture is crucial to sustained success and creativity, and fun has to be an emergent property of that. But my point earlier on was just if you do have a chief fun officer, and it's almost like Disney, God help you, because you're all sort of having to goose step to have fun, and I just think that's not going to work.
That's making 40-year-olds walk around in the baking heat wearing a duck outfit. Hardly fun, but
no.
Yeah, I mean, culture is an interesting thing. I get asked that a lot. My listeners ask a lot about how to install culture, how to create culture. I have my own view, which is sometimes it's about how you start the business. Actually, one of the reasons I think Facebook has a real problem today is, in fact, how the business started, where Mark Zuckerberg stole someone else's idea. And he might have executed it better than anyone else on the planet, but ultimately we all know it wasn't his idea. And if your culture starts off that way, you're willing to steal someone's idea, why wouldn't you be willing to steal someone's data?
Yeah.
And so now this won't get shared on Facebook, it will get blocked. But, my point being, just being open about it, sometimes that's how culture starts, doesn't it? It starts by your very actions in the early days on a personal level, even if it's got nothing to do with what the company's doing.
Well, it's funny just thinking back in the 4 organizations I've been practically involved in co-founding. There's always been a tension at their heart. There have always been people have actually really liked each other and actually on occasion sort of really loved each other. And yet there has been this constant friction between people who see the world differently and are prepared to speak about those differences. And with the co-founder of sustainability, for example, Julia Hales, we used to go and see companies like Procter & Gamble and ferociously disagree in public rather than singing from the same song sheet. I mean, about whether animal welfare was important or whatever it was. And the right sort of clients would say, actually, we get as much value out of seeing how that interplay happens as we do about practically what you're advising us to do. And I think that tension remains absolutely critical, because if you don't have that, and I don't think Zuckerberg does have it, I think he's surrounded by people who just think he's God. If you don't have it, you're going to pay for it over time. And I think Putin will pay, and I think Trump's going to pay, Bolsonaro is going to pay, and Duterte, and all of these different populist dictators. And we find them in business as well, sadly. But they'll always be with us because,
Well, you need them as well. You need them. I think Trump, I'm not a fan. I have a lot of listeners that are fans of Trump, and that's fine. But I'm not, and I feel like, however, what he is good at is creating the conversation about what's wrong with what he's doing. And so in some respects, people need that as a counterpoint to, just as you say, the Procter & Gamble example. Like these guys need that debate because it's happening anyway. Whether the people are having these conversations, and I think it's good to have it in the open and to hear what people think so that you can frankly adjust and survive.
No, I think that's a crucial element of healthy cultures.
And I want listeners to pick up on another great insight you're kind of highlighting there around culture. I think having conflict is actually nothing wrong with having conflict. Having the ability to have conflict resolution is important, right? So, I mean, I always say to people, I've been married happily for 21 years, but we probably had an argument every month of that 21 years, but that's been healthy.
Yes.
So I know plenty of people that say, I never argue with my wife, and they get divorced. Because that tension's probably, you've been married 52 years, did you say?
Well, today is actually our wedding anniversary. We got married in 73, but we actually moved in together in 1968. Right. And what a year that was. So there have been plenty.
Thank you for giving us time. I feel like we should give a big shout out to your wife. What's your wife's name?
Elaine.
Thank you, Elaine, for giving us John today.
One of the great things is she's sort of immensely flexible. She'd have to be, wouldn't she? But there we go.
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, that's the other thing. I guess talking about culture, you're talking about people disagreeing with each other. I think your partner in life, if you're going to start a business, you need that partner to be on your side. Too many people I see have a good idea, raise good money, are willing to work hard, but their partner pulls them in the opposite direction. And then,
being an entrepreneur, as I sometimes have been, that two of the organizations I co-founded started off in our family home in the 1980s. And at one stage we had, I think, 5 or 6 people working from a small London home. And Elaine sort of put up with that for, I think, about 3 or 4 years, and then was just really heartily glad to be shot of that when we moved out into grown-up offices. But that it was amazing too how that family environment, our daughters were quite young then, really inflected so much of the culture that then shaped those two organizations afterwards. It sort of goes into the genetic coding in some way, the woodwork.
The family environment. I mean, I have exactly the same. My wife, who supported me my whole career, crazy decisions I made, took my 3-year-old son out, who's a handful at the moment, my 2 dogs, basically so I can do this podcast show with you today at home, and she doesn't even say, she doesn't complain about it once. And I think...
And what's her name?
Her name's Helen. It's not our wedding anniversary. Helen. She gets all she loves she needs on the 16th of September, but it's definitely an important part. I want my listeners to pick up on that too as well. The partnerships you have in life, conflict is good, right? I mean, do you have any tips on conflict resolution?
I should do, shouldn't I? I think part of it is never getting to the point where you're locked in and you have no escape, and to be conscious of the fact that people do really come at these issues, whether they're practical work-life balance issues or whether they're what sort of client you should work with or what sort of organization you should work with and what's appropriate to do. And one of the things I've often generally tried to do, is not to decide on other people's behalf, but to put it out to them. So, for example, there were moments where we were working with clients who I felt it would be appropriate that we resigned from. And we did that several times. And there were other occasions where there was a lot of money on the table for us to work with particular companies, but they were in industries that were really problematic. And so I'd put that out, or we would put that out to the team to vote. And even when there was a real financial cost to the individual team members, they voted in what I thought was the right way. I mean, clearly I'd try and inform the debate, but I didn't force it. So I think if there is an element of co-evolution, there is more sort of respect across the team, perhaps, than there would be if somebody at the top decides, Jeff Bezos or Zuckerberg or whatever, and then, it's their fault. But when things do get bad, on occasion we've had problems in some of the teams. In one case, a very long time ago, it went to a lawsuit which we lost. I mean, it's sort of somebody who claimed unfair dismissal. And when you're a very small organization, it's very easy to allow emotions to sort of ripple through. And then you do suddenly find yourself in a court of law. And then you have to become a little bit more process oriented. But I never want to lose that startup culture in a way. I think there's something about that which is not only exciting and productive, but it's where I like to be. I've tried to keep organizations that I've been involved in much smaller than the market would naturally have them. And some people are happy with that and others may not be.
I always try to translate wisdom like this into kind of a tangible piece of information for people. But I think startup culture, for example, what is startup culture? You've got the Facebook startup culture, which is all about programming and creating, automated world. And then I guess you've got, there's lots of, the culture is an interesting word, isn't it? Because it can also be a negative word.
Yeah.
And
totally.
So, keeping that culture, I think what you're saying there, my interpretation of what you've just said is an element of democracy. There's an element, you like the democratic approach to things, like the concept of, don't decide for other people, let other people decide for them. In a way, you're saying, okay, this is the decision we need to make. I can make it, but the culture of this company is we're in it together. So what do you guys all think? Is that a fair interpretation of what you're saying?
It is, but it's different depending on the sort of company or organization or industry that you're talking about, because some of them are simply about cranking a handle and doing it more efficiently. And the whole total quality management world was about how do you make things more efficient. But at the same time, maybe what you need is a springboard, something that takes you into a very different space where it's uncomfortable. And I think the startup culture is about, let's have efficiency where it's appropriate to have it, but let's remember that efficiency often squeezes out resilience, and you need resilience if you're going to take big risks. So I think that sort of springboard mindset is really important as well. And one thing I've learned over a long period is that what suits me and what makes me comfortable in terms of I have quite a high appetite for risk doesn't suit other people, and they may not say it, but they are stressed by it. And sustainability as an organization, I kept off balance for 20 plus years, and then I left. And it worked. It was commercially successful, and I think in terms of our impact on the wider world, it was successful. But it did strike me afterwards that I should have done more to acknowledge the stress that you're constantly going into new areas where you're constantly having to learn, constantly having to make it up as you go along. That's where I'm happiest. But I think we've got to help our teams if that's what we decide or they decide they want to do. It's not natural for a lot of people. We've got to help them.
It's interesting you say appetite for risk. Is that something you've always had, or is it the appetite grown over time?
I think I've always had it. I've been a cyclist for, since 1970 in London. And during that time, I've been unconscious 4 times.
I'd say, how are you still alive?
Well, I had 3 broken ribs twice. I think mercifully they're the same ribs. And I finally gave up about 3 years ago because I was knocked off by a Russian family and really damaged my elbow. I've actually started cycling again now because so.
I thought with the Russian family, you were going to do some stereotype that it turned out with some relatives of Putin's, and they kind of took the bike away and said, "You're never going to bike ride again," and you said, "Sure."
Not at all. But it's funny because London, during the period I've lived and worked here, has become not only an international city but a global city, and we all know that. And so, of all of those, I mean, the first person who knocked me off was Indonesian, 1975. Third one was Mongolian. The 5th one was 3 young African men, new to London. And the 6th one was this young girl who jumped out into Oxford Street in front of me, and I had to throw myself sideways to miss her. And there are people who just don't know the city, not used to it, or in one case actually wanted to kill me, but that's quite another story. So I have a sort of appetite for risk. Luckily, Elaine, my wife, is sort of broadly tolerant of it.
Broadly tolerant. But were you like that as a child? I mean, were your parents very encouraging of this kind of purpose-driven way of thinking, or is it something? It's just, my question I have for you is: are entrepreneurs born or bred? But I wonder, is there a deeper thing that's happened in your life that's made you realise that this was there already, or did your parents give this all to you?
I think the enthusiasm and interest in the natural world was there right from the get-go. In fact, my first memory goes back to that natural world. My father turned out to be a bit more entrepreneurial in later life, but wasn't a natural entrepreneur, although in a way not an accident that he was in the Air Force. If you're going to be in the armed forces, the Air Force were probably the least regimented and restricted. But no, I think the entrepreneurial bit sort of crept up on me. It just, I didn't want to do the conventional things. So the only way to really operate was to set up your own organization and do it that way. So
yeah, I was looking at your CV and your first job, it looks like 1974. I was born in 1974, but it's a senior planner and associate director at Transport and Environmental Studies, which sounds like a very senior role. I'm assuming that wasn't your first job, but what did you first start out? Did you do an entrepreneurial thing when you were a kid? Were you selling lemonade in the street in environmentally friendly glass bottles or what?
Can you hear the truck outside? There's a truck sort of unloading.
Yeah, I can hear it. We love trucks in the background, us
really?
Folks on podcasts. Yeah, no.
Well, he may go eventually, but all right, that's fine.
No, don't worry. People, we'll either edit it out or keep it in because it's funny. We'll see. Someone's trying to stop people from hearing your story. That's some anti-environmental group out there trying to block out the noise.
Remind me of what the question was.
I've even forgotten it myself. No, so when you were young, though, I mean, do you feel when was the entrepreneurial piece there, the risk piece? Because I think for a lot of my listeners, that risk is still an alien concept. In fact, I think it gets trained out of people. Don't take risk. For example, get a mortgage when you're young. This is one of my pet peeves. Get a mortgage when you're young. That's safe. When you're 60, and like I said, you have a property. But then what about taking risk and traveling, experiencing the world, those sorts of things that perhaps are more important to your point earlier in the podcast?
I think I've always had a risk tolerance. I mean, I'm talking to you from a house that we bought in 1975. And when we bought it, it was a complete and absolute ruin. My parents-in-law came to see it and they thought we'd gone completely clinically insane. And for 4 years, I really had to build it from the ground up. I mean, even putting new walls onto the floorboards and so on. So there is a tolerance for risk, but I actually think there's something else. In addition to the natural world connection, I think with my parents, we traveled a lot when I was a child. So we lived in places like Northern Ireland, we lived in Cyprus, we visited places like Israel and so on. And in a way, I came back to the UK when I was 9, and I think I felt an outsider. I felt an alien, not in a bad way particularly, but you just didn't feel a natural part of things. And that outsider mentality, I think, has actually been quite important because in a way in dealing with business, I've been a sort of an environmentalist and a sustainability champion and so on, but I've somehow managed that insider-outsider balance and I've often said to clients, big companies, that if it ever comes to the crunch we're probably going to side with the NGOs, with the activists, the campaigners. They're not uniformly right, but broadly they're on the right side of history. And my sense is you're probably not going to be. And very interesting just to see Ben van Vuren, the CEO of Shell, just recently talking about his concern that Shell, which is a company I've worked with in the past, feels that it's on the wrong side of history with fossil fuels and so on. So I think that outsider mentality, which sort of, I don't think there's a handbook and how to be. I was once described as grit in the corporate oyster, so that you're there and you're sort of creating a certain tension. People would rather not be challenged in quite that way. But sometimes because you're challenging in that way, they get to places or thoughts that they wouldn't otherwise get to. Yeah, you can track a lot of it back to younger years. But actually, I also think the 60s were a crucible in which quite a number of people in the baby boom generation just changed. And there were many influences there that I can think back to. And I think, well, that's where some of this stuff came from. Yeah, so thank you to that lot.
No, I think it's again, I want the listeners to pick up on this, and it's such an important piece, I think, which is cultural experiences. How can you build a culture if you've not had experience of lots of cultures? Yeah. So I think the upbringing there was what I think you're talking about. You've kind of answered my question in a way, which is, are entrepreneurs born or bred? The way I've interpreted your answer is that there's a bred piece there that was always naturally in you, this nature piece. But then the bred piece was that experience with the world, what was out there outside of, say, England, what else was happening, both from an environmental perspective and a cultural perspective. Yeah. And that has shaped you into, your CV today. And so I think a lot of people that are listening, they may well have, and I think a lot of people do have, they're born entrepreneurs, but their environment has bred it out of them. And so
I think it's true. And if I just think back, just a final comment on that sort of childhood was, my father was very odd. I mean, he was in the Air Force, but he wouldn't live on Air Force bases. He was unique in that. He would always live in the community, even when it was dangerous to do so. In Northern Ireland, we lived on a farm, and the IRA were around. In Cyprus, we lived in Nicosia in the heart of the city, not on an armed base, and because of that, I met all sorts of people I wouldn't otherwise have met. So I in fact, I owe him a considerable debt. He may not have been particularly entrepreneurial, but he was seriously weird, and I think I inherited some of that.
One of the main traits of entrepreneurship is, in my view, risk. Sounds like you took a risk. You wanted to be a part of the culture. I think about the Northern Ireland example you just given there. I mean, he's taking a risk there. The bases are built to protect you from the enemy. Yes. So there you are, sitting with the enemy. But I think that gives you incredible, tangible experience that you will not get if you're stuck inside an ecosystem. Personally, I'm sure this is true for you. If you go on holiday somewhere, I hate staying in these big complexes where you're basically, you might as well be, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, it's just sunny instead of rainy, but that's it. Where it's nothing more exciting, I've gone to Indonesia, for example, than actually hanging out in the streets. I've been to Kenya, actually hanging out in the streets, even living in a street house on a road in Kenya that isn't really a road. That's a real experience. Living in some 5-star luxury hotel doesn't really show you what's really going on, right? That's kind of what you're talking about, I think, there, which is an amazing experience for a young person. But I bet when you were young, you didn't feel that way. Did you always feel like you were moving too much?
No, I love the different places that we lived. I mean, with a sort of real intensity. But my main memory is just when we would leave and feeling that you had friends that you would never see again, particularly when we left Cyprus. So that, but in a sense, that's where that sense of being an outsider came from. You sort of had to almost protect yourself, knowing that you might get to know people, but then you'd sort of be wrenched.
There's also probably an element of counterbalance there. Why, since 1975, you've lived in the same home. So there's a time and a place to be moving around a lot, right?
Probably, yeah. And hadn't thought about it particularly, but yes.
Do you think your education helped you?
How can you know otherwise? The simple answer is during the time that we traveled, I had a very fractured education, and some of it was quite difficult. So in Northern Ireland, for example, my brother and I were sent to a Catholic convent school. We were notional Protestants. There were 3 notional Protestants in the school. We got roughed up pretty much every day for 3 years. Never really thought about it, but it was a suppressed violence because the Catholic convent school was embedded in a Protestant community, and you just had this sort of static charge that came through. One of the most extraordinary moments in my entire life, which was foundational, happened because of all of that. And the same in we went to an Air Force school in Cyprus. But when we came back to the UK, was almost sent to a concentration camp. I mean, it was a prep school that did me incredible good. But in the end, the headmaster was sent to an asylum because he was so incredibly violent. And a lot of that has only come out in recent years. And then I went to a very liberal school, Bryanston, which I think was the making of me. I think from a very early age, you were encouraged to devote your own time to what interested you. And by God, I made use of that. And then I did go to university twice. It wasn't any expectation of my family. First to a very new and very radical university, Essex, which blew up while I was there in the student rebellions. In fact, my wife's prior boyfriend was one of the ringleaders of all of that. And then I went after some time to UCL, which is where I studied city planning. And that was more staid, that was more static, but it was part of London. And again, both of those universities I used as a springboard to do things that were quite different from what I should have been learning. And actually, longer term to your question, I think that served me very well, but I didn't know at the time particularly.
I can see, like I mentioned earlier, that you worked as a senior planner for a few years, and then it seems like your first business, your own business, was in 1978, ENDS Report.
Yeah.
And so how did, for my listeners trying to understand how to make the transition, say, from employment to working for yourself, what happened there for you? What was the journey? How did you start your own thing?
Well, the Environmental Data Services, which is the company we set up in 1978, there were 2 other people who were really, really important in setting that up. One had founded a group that was very successful called Incomes Data Services, and they tracked labor relations and so on at the time when unions were very much more powerful. And so he invested in Environmental Data Services, or ENDS. And the second person, was one of the founders of the environmental movement. He'd founded the World Wildlife Fund with Peter Scott. His name was Max Nicholson. And I'd been writing while working for a prior firm, Transport and Environment Studies, or TEST. I'd been writing for New Scientist, and I'd been doing a monthly, quite major feature. And some of it was quite hard-hitting, let's say. And because of that, Max came to me and said, would I be the founding editor and then later managing director of ENDS. So there was, again, a degree of serendipity. Max came across me because of something that I was doing that was almost extracurricular. It wasn't something that I was actually meant to be doing as part of my professional employment, although it did come into that. And then one thing led to another. And it was very difficult for the first few years because business did not want to talk about safety or health or environment. So again, it was like being a Trojan horse. It was, except that you didn't want to lay waste to what was on the other side of the wall. But you were trying to get into companies, and initially it was incredibly problematic. You felt yourself really lucky if you got through the front gate and you met PR people or lawyers. Now, I mean, it would be routine to go into the boardroom and deal with CEOs and chief financial officers, not chief fund officers or whatever. But so it was a campaign. I mean, I look back now and it was very much a style of activism, but it was almost on a business to business basis. We were a limited company that gave people some sense that we were legitimate in a way, or not completely anti-business. Yeah, I mean, I wish there was an easy way of saying, here's the formula. But in every case, it was something that felt at the time like a natural progression that's felt quite exciting to be involved in, a bit of a challenge.
Was it a yes as soon as you were asked to do this? Was it like, yeah, I'll be a founding editor for
no,
this?
it wasn't. It wasn't. In fact, I asked Max to fund a project for 6 weeks where I could stay with the original firm Test, and they were paid for the work. But at the end of it, I actually felt, there's something here which is really important to do. And I'd written about business before, but I hadn't actually worked for business. So I thought this is actually an interesting next step. But there's also been an odd balancing act that when we set up sustainability, for example, in 1987, we were working on a book called The Green Consumer Guide, which ended up selling 1 million copies and going into 20 foreign language editions and so on. But it was a major headache for the companies that we actually wanted to work with. And 2 of them sued us. McDonald's sued us, and ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, which paradoxically was a client at the time, but a different part of the company, 3 different parts of the company sued us. We won all of those court cases. But
that must have been scary at the time. You really do have high risk appetite. Idea of McDonald's, ICI coming after me for even talking about them on this podcast show scares me.
Well, it's funny because I went to see a lawyer, our own lawyer, to say, what do we do? And he said, look, you've got no choice. You've got to cave in. These people will crush you, whether you're right or wrong. And then just as I was standing up to leave, he said, okay, unless, of course, you want to play poker. And I'd never played poker in my life, but I knew the nature of the game. And that very night, I went down to Cardiff to do a radio broadcast. It was the BBC. It was 8 million listeners. The comedian Pamela Stephenson was on the panel. It was the guy who was a rock star, and there was a television scientist. And after the broadcast, which was live, a couple of people from McDonald's came up and said, during the broadcast, you talked about the allegations. And I said, well, it wasn't me. It was the rock star from Hue and Cry. And they said, well, you can't do that. You're subject to an injunction. And then I thought, well, this is the poker moment. And they said, I said, we're now actually going to go to court. We found enough on McDonald's to really drag you through the mud. And the 2 women who'd come up, it was rather unkind of me, but they then said, oh, would you talk to our president? And I said, well, if he'll call me. And it was a he. And he rang the next morning and he said, what do you want to get off our backs? And I told them. And they then spent about a month doing what we'd asked them to do. And then we had this incredible set piece meeting with their lawyers in a big tower block in London. And it was one of those moments, they basically were going to kill our company. But in the end, they didn't. And right at the end of the process, they said, would we work with them? And my answer was never on the basis of what we've seen. But I didn't go into that knowingly thinking that's how it's going to play out. But once it had started, it's like being committed to a wave on a surfboard. You have to go through with it.
I think there's such a fantastic insight there again. In a way, you're still talking about being an outsider too, but to these big companies who do put a lot of pressure on people, and like you say, you feel like you're going to lose for sure. Pushing back and being an outsider can scare them. It's not David Goliath, not wanting to get religious about it, but or that whole concept that actually, I've had a similar situation, by the way. Yeah. I had a similar situation but I think the key, of course, is that, are you on the right side of history? That's the question I ask myself. Am I actually wrong here, or are they actually wrong in the eyes of the planet? And so, I think ultimately, like Nelson Mandela is a good example. You go to prison for it. In the end, people are going to know the truth, right? In the end, you're going to be a hero if you are on the right side of history. It just depends, question of time, isn't it?
No guarantees.
But you have to play poker. That's brave. That was brave to play that game. Well, glad you won.
But it's funny because I think about that sort of risk that's come through. And part of what we've always done is never to assume that the people we're working with in business are bad people. They may be doing bad things, but there is a separate. Sometimes it's because they don't know. Sometimes it's because they feel that they have no choice. But there are bad people, and when you come across them, you have to stand up. And I remember once having a stand-up row with Rex Tillerson, who went on to become Trump's Secretary of State, but he was then CEO of ExxonMobil. And I was in Stavanger. I was talking to a conference of about 300 fossil fuel people, and I was talking about how Exxon had corrupted the political process around climate change, and for a very long time. And Tillerson walked into the back of the room with his entourage and bawled across these sort of nonplussed conference delegates, "That's a goddamn lie." But I should do it in a much more robust voice. And then about 2 weeks later, the media were all carrying the story that that's exactly what they've been doing. So I had based it on the facts, but every so often, and he and I had this sort of really quite charged row. And in the end, we ended up daggers drawn. But no, sometimes you just have to take a stand where people are almost criminally wrong. And I think Exxon have been pretty much criminally wrong on climate change. You've got to stand your ground. So that I always say we're not neutral. We're trying to be objective and professional and neutral about 15 to 20 years in the future. So trying to bring what the future would require from us back into the present world and articulate that somehow.
I think people not being neutral is good, actually. I think that's one of my problems with media. They pretend that they're neutral. I mean, you and I met each other in a Telegraph debate, and you know, you can kind of, if you do enough digging, what side they lean, but I don't think there's enough transparency. It's one of the reasons I like The Economist, for example. I like reading The Economist because at least they tell you their opinion, and you know that it's their opinion. This is their view. But I think so often, I mean, definitely in business, a lot of the time, companies have to coattail to the big corporates to get their business. Yeah. So that's a tricky game to play, I guess, especially in a business where you're still, like you've described a few of your businesses, they're still looking to generate income to make them sustainable, right?
Yeah, and I like The Economist too. I particularly like the Financial Times, but The Economist has gone through periods of being switched on to the agenda that I'm sort of trying to serve, and being at other times being incredibly snarky. And what you look both at The Economist now and the Financial Times, and a lot of the other Bloomberg-style media, business media, and they're absolutely overflowing with content, not just on climate change, but on ESG investment and all of these different aspects. It's an astonishing moment in all of this, where a lot of stuff that we've been experimenting with is suddenly coming into the mainstream. So it's an immensely exciting moment, but again, challenging, because once these things mainstream, some of the definitions and ideas and concepts so on get diluted because people have their invested interests, which they bring to bear. So it won't always be fun, but by God, it'll be exciting.
Totally. Well, you've written 20 books, so I've got a feeling I could speak to you all day long. The amount of insight and knowledge you've got, it just blows my mind. I've written one book, which will be out in November, and that's that one book of 12 chapters has covered my whole life. So I don't know how you managed to do 20. And
I would love to see that when it comes out.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, well, I'll send you a copy. But I'm going to read all your books, and I'm excited. I think a lot of my listeners.
I wouldn't.
No,
because I wouldn't. I can suggest 3 or 4 that I would recommend, but it's just that. Some of them were period pieces. For example, one of them was called. It was a penguin. It was 1985. It was called The Poisoned Womb, and it was about reproductive toxicology, which will sound completely wild and out of frame for a lot of your listeners. But Ted Hughes, he was then the poet laureate, did a poem around the book, and it was published in the Times and so on. So some of these things have ripple effects, but the book itself, I think it stood the test of time, but I wouldn't recommend that one as sort of main.
To me, it's like when you find a director that you like, you might watch some of their old movies and not be exactly, but you like the genre, you like the style, or you watch them learn as they create these things. By the way, I'm dyslexic, so actually what I mean is my wife will read them to me, so let's see if I can get her to read all 20 of your books to me. But certainly I'm going to read the latest
Helen,
one.
I don't recommend that sort of purgatory on any of anyone, but
no.
Anyway, but thank you for the expression of interest.
No, I'm going to read The Green Swan, that's for sure. And thank you for giving us your time. I absolutely would love to have you back on. I've got a whole series of things I've written down that actually I'd like to talk about, innovation, and go deeper into things like culture, talk about The Green Swan a little bit more. So I'd love to have you back. I'm going to sum up what I've taken away from today very quickly. But I just, before I say it, I just want to say thank you so much for taking your time out, especially on your wedding anniversary day. So
Thank you,
that so much. I'm excited to see what you do in the next 10 to 15 years. Myself and my listeners, we're here if you need anything to help in any of the causes that you're championing on our behalf. So thank you. But I'm going to quickly sum up some of the things I've taken away. I think letting people don't decide on other people's behalf is something that really resonates with me. And although people might translate that as I did into democracy, it is an interesting thing, not to let people be trapped, give people options. I think in business, this is something not talked about enough, but co-founders, for example, often fall out with each other. Sometimes it's the argument for not having marriage because people feel trapped, but it's not marriage that makes you trapped, it's your mindset. And I think giving people the option to make decisions and having an open debate about things, even if you don't agree with them, is a fantastic bit of insight there. I do like this concept of reinvent yourself. I think that's very current for today's world. I think a lot of companies should do it. And it's good to hear some examples you've highlighted there of people that are thinking long term and not just about how they can profit. I was just looking at Amazon and Jeff Bezos being $400 billion richer since COVID began. That doesn't seem right to me. But having said that, he can reinvent himself and give some of that success back into the system. Then, that's what it's about, I think. On an individual level, as you mentioned earlier, people now have many chances and many careers in life. There's no longer one job like it was in Japan, as you mentioned, for your whole life. But there really is an opportunity to reinvent yourself. I reckon there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 careers in a lifetime now. So, reinventing yourself, such a powerful phrase I want people to take home. I like this concept that you're lucky to get shot down. You told that story. I think that's such a good expression for life. Actually, we should make it into a T-shirt. You might think getting shot down was bad news.
I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah, I think you might find you're lucky to get shot down. That there's something in it. Of course, we mentioned it a few times, but I love it too, which is this be an outsider. I think so many people don't realize that, a lot of people that I know myself, I went and lived overseas for a while and I built a company. And in a way, being a foreigner in that country was a benefit because I didn't understand the culture. So I didn't know what people were thinking about me. I didn't know how people were judging me because I didn't understand the culture. So I just went and built stuff. And so sometimes in England, for example, a lot of people get trapped into the culture of how much money you're making, what car do you drive, where do you live, as if any of this stuff matters. It doesn't. You go live in a foreign place or go live in a new location and you're an outsider. It's very empowering. So if you can't move overseas, just change your mindset. Be an outsider. Don't have to follow what everyone else is doing and buy a house when you're 18 necessarily. There's lots of options, and I like people to take that home from this podcast today. And finally, I say two things. One is I love this business model. It's kind of like, which you mentioned at the beginning, which is make a profit and have a rule in there where you can't be pushed around, which allows you to stick to your culture and your moral code and those things, and then have fun. Those kind of three elements to me are just the best kind of business model you could possibly have. And I've tried to
make a difference does come in there, Simon.
Absolutely, completely. Yes. I think overarching my final words on this are, purpose. When I read your CV, purpose comes through. And I think that's that's why you've worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and your wife's not minded that at all. And you've, of course, today looking at the future as an exciting opportunity because it's purpose. At the top of it all, from everything you've said, I feel like you've got a strong purpose. I hope people take that energy and put that into their businesses and into their lives. And I'll finally say people should get a Labradoodle because if they've got allergies, they're good dogs to have. So.
Or a lurcher.
Or a lurcher, yeah. So many learnings, and hopefully we've just increased the amount of Labradoodles that get adopted right now. So, and lurchers. Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, John.
Thank you, Simon.
Really enjoyed it.
Until soon.
Thank you so much for listening to the Good Luck Club podcast. We know you have thousands of podcasts you could be listening to, but you've chosen to listen to ours. Our mission is to help 1 million people start a business of their own. And anyone out there that started a business, never feel alone doing it. I hope you have found John's insights useful today. I know I did. And if you found anything he had to say useful, imagine how useful his book is to you. go to the link below and buy it. At the very least, give him a like on his social media and say hello. We thank you for listening to us today.